Snow falls over a silent northern landscape. The wind cuts through the frozen air, whispering over the bones of a long-dead world. In the distance, a group of men stand around a wooden post, their torches burning against the pale dawn. At the center of the circle, a man kneels, bound, trembling, his breath rising in misty clouds. The axe gleams, and in that final heartbeat before the blade falls, he looks up toward the sky, not in fear, but in defiance. For the Vikings, death was never the end. But what truly terrified them was something far worse: the destruction of their honor, the shattering of their spirit. The Viking world was not ruled by mercy. It was built on a brutal philosophy. Strength was sacred, weakness was blasphemy. Every act of punishment was a message carved into flesh, a warning to all who dared betray the code. To understand Viking justice, one must first understand their soul. They believed the human spirit was a battlefield between gods and chaos, and punishment was a weapon to control it. When a man broke an oath, stole from kin, or defied the gods, he didn't just commit a crime, he fractured the balance of the universe. The punishment that followed was not only to make him suffer, it was to repair that cosmic imbalance through pain. To the Vikings, punishment was both theater and theology. It was performed publicly with ritual precision, under the watchful eyes of the community and, they believed, the gods themselves. A man's final cries were not simply screams, they were prayers, offerings, and confessions all at once. In a world where even the afterlife demanded courage, dying well mattered more than living long. The idea of being broken, of dying a coward, of begging for mercy, was worse than any physical torment. A true Viking feared only one thing: to die without honor. The North was a cruel teacher. Its winters were endless, its seas merciless, and its gods demanding. In such a place, suffering became sacred. The Vikings saw pain as a form of truth, a pure test that stripped away the lies of the flesh to reveal the soul beneath. That is why their punishments were designed not only to end life, but to expose what a man truly was in his final moments. To scream or to remain silent, to curse or to laugh in death, those final choices determined how one would be remembered. The punishments were not designed to kill swiftly. They were crafted to make men confront every ounce of fear and regret within them. Each act of execution was a ritual of breaking, of mind, of body, of identity. Those who watched learned through terror what it meant to be human in a world ruled by gods of war. In their pain, the condemned became a mirror, reflecting everything their society valued: courage, pride, submission, and sacrifice. But this obsession with suffering wasn't born of cruelty alone. Beneath the blood and brutality lay a strange form of faith, the belief that pain could purify the soul. When the Vikings punished someone, they believed they were restoring the sacred balance between mankind and the divine. Every lash, every cut, every scream echoed through both worlds, the mortal and the spiritual. Justice was not a human act, it was divine choreography. And those who endured it were unwilling participants in a play written by gods. Even today, the legends of Viking punishments disturb the modern mind, not only because of their physical horror, but because of what they reveal about human psychology. The Vikings understood something dark and timeless: that true domination is not achieved by destroying the body, but by breaking the spirit. They sought not only to make their enemies die, but to make them yield. Their punishments were designed to reach inside a person and shatter their sense of self, to make them question whether they were still human. Imagine standing in that frozen circle, hearing the cries of a condemned man carried across the icy wind. You smell the iron of blood, feel the weight of judgment in the air, and realize that you too are being judged, by the gods, by the crowd, by your own soul. The Vikings didn't invent cruelty. They merely perfected it as a form of meaning. To them, pain was not chaos, it was order. And through it, they found connection, to each other, to their ancestors, to the gods who demanded suffering as proof of devotion. As the snow continues to fall over the lifeless figure at the center of the circle, the torchlight flickers in the eyes of those watching. There is no applause, no pity, only silence. The ritual is over, the balance restored. But the echo of that moment lingers, even centuries later, whispering the same question through the northern winds. When punishment becomes sacred, what remains of mercy? There was no courtroom in the Viking world, no judges in robes, no written laws etched on parchment. Justice lived in the open air, beneath the vast gray sky, where men gathered in a circle to decide the fates of the guilty and the doomed. This gathering was called the Thing, the ancient heart of Viking law. Here, beneath banners of kin and clan, bloodlines and honor collided. The law speaker, chosen for his memory and wisdom, stood before the crowd and recited justice not from scrolls, but from the echoes of his ancestors. Every sentence he spoke was both law and legend, a reminder that the rules of men were born from the will of gods. Viking law was not created to protect life. It was created to preserve order. To them, society was a fragile agreement between mortals and the divine, a thread that could unravel at the smallest betrayal. A theft, a broken oath, or an act of cowardice was more than a crime. It was an act of spiritual imbalance, a ripple that offended both kin and the gods who watched from above. Their punishments, therefore, were designed not to reform, but to restore. The guilty were not seen as individuals who had failed. They were seen as wounds that had to be cauterized, no matter the pain. At the center of Viking justice stood a sacred principle known as wergild, the man price. Every life had a value, carefully measured in silver, livestock, or goods. If a man killed another, he could restore balance by paying that price. It was a system that turned vengeance into economy, morality into transaction. But the wergild could not save everyone. Certain crimes, treason, oath-breaking, blasphemy, carried no price, no forgiveness. Those acts demanded something beyond payment. They demanded spectacle. The blood of the guilty was the only coin that the gods would accept. Public punishment served two purposes. It restored divine harmony and reminded the living of their place within it. Each execution, each humiliation, was a sermon in flesh. The people gathered not merely to watch, but to witness, to participate in the ritual reaffirmation of order. The condemned was paraded before the crowd, stripped not only of clothing but of name and identity. Their shame became a public performance, their pain an offering. The air filled with prayers, chants, or silence, depending on the gravity of the crime. In that moment, the boundaries between faith and fear dissolved. Punishment became religion, and the execution ground became a temple. It's tempting to see the Vikings as savages, but their justice was not chaotic. It was meticulously structured, deeply philosophical, and spiritually bound. Every decision at the Thing followed an ancient logic. That pain was truth. A man's courage during punishment revealed the purity of his soul. Those who endured pain without screaming were believed to meet the gods with honor. Those who broke down confirmed their guilt in the eyes of both men and heaven. The body was not just punished, it was tested. The Thing was not always a place of death. It was also a stage for reconciliation. Two clans might settle a feud there, trading silver, land, or blood to close old wounds. But even peace was transactional. Beneath every handshake was the unspoken understanding that violence could return at any moment. Justice in Viking society was fluid, a negotiation between honor and revenge. The system worked only because everyone understood the stakes. Mercy was rare, forgiveness conditional, and weakness fatal. When divine justice was invoked, the tone shifted. Priests and chieftains spoke of Odin's wrath, of Thor's strength, of Loki's cunning deceit. They believed that every crime echoed through the realms, that even small acts of betrayal offended the gods. Punishment was a form of communication, a way to tell the divine that the balance had been restored. The executioner's axe was a sacred tool, the scaffold, a symbol of purification. Even the condemned man's blood, soaking into the frozen ground, was thought to feed the soil, returning his corrupted life to the earth that bore him. What made Viking justice truly terrifying was not its brutality, but its conviction. The people didn't see cruelty, they saw righteousness. When they watched a thief lose his hand, or a murderer lose his head, they believed they were cleansing the community of spiritual disease. To them, suffering was not evil, it was necessary. And this belief made their punishments far more dangerous than mere barbarity. For when cruelty is sanctified, it becomes impossible to question. In this world, fear was the foundation of obedience. Every man, woman, and child knew the price of disobedience, not only in flesh but in reputation. A single accusation could destroy generations of honor. A single act of cowardice could erase a man's name from the songs of his people. The threat of punishment was a psychological chain that bound the community together. Even the innocent carried its weight, knowing that one misstep could make them the next spectacle. And yet, there was beauty in this dark order, a kind of grim poetry in their devotion to balance. The Vikings believed that the gods themselves abided by these laws, that even Odin was bound by the consequences of his actions. Justice was not arbitrary, it was cosmic. Every punishment, no matter how cruel, was part of a divine symmetry, a dance of crime and consequence stretching across worlds. In the end, Viking justice wasn't about control. It was about harmony, a harmony born of fear, faith, and fire. Their punishments were stories written in blood, retold to ensure that no one forgot what it meant to betray the sacred order. And as each generation gathered at the Thing, under the same cold northern sky, they repeated the ritual once more, reciting laws older than memory, spilling blood to keep their fragile world from falling into chaos. They called it the Blood Eagle, a name whispered through sagas, carried by the breath of terrified men, half myth and half memory. Even among the Vikings, who revered pain as a sacred test, this was something beyond punishment. It was an act of divine theater, a ritual so horrifying, so precise, that it was said to open a gateway between man and the gods. The Blood Eagle was not meant merely to kill, it was meant to unmake a person, to tear their soul apart before the eyes of both mortals and immortals. It began with silence. The condemned, usually a traitor, murderer, or enemy chief, was brought before the assembled crowd. No word was spoken as the executioners approached, their hands cold and steady. The victim would be stripped naked, his back marked with runes that symbolized sacrifice to Odin, the god of wisdom and death. Then, with a single stroke, the first cut was made, deep and deliberate, tracing the line of the spine. The knife did not stop until it touched bone. With ritual precision, the ribs were severed from the spine one by one. The executioners worked methodically, never rushing, for this was not a common execution, it was an offering. The rib cage was then spread open, like the wings of an eagle unfurling from flesh. The lungs were pulled outward, placed upon the shoulders of the victim. To the onlookers, it appeared as though the condemned had grown wings, grotesque, crimson wings, the mark of divine judgment. In that moment, the man was no longer human. He was the sacrifice, the message, and the lesson. According to the sagas, the Blood Eagle was reserved for those who committed the greatest sin of all, betrayal. Killing a man in battle was honorable, breaking an oath, killing kin, or defying one's lord was unforgivable. Such crimes shattered the fabric of Viking morality. Only the Blood Eagle, it was believed, could restore that balance. It was not an act of vengeance, but purification, the soul's punishment for its own corruption. Historians still debate whether the Blood Eagle truly happened, or whether it was a myth born from poetic exaggeration. Some claim it was a literary symbol, a metaphor for vengeance so intense it transcended the physical. But archaeology tells a quieter, darker story. Carved stones from the Viking Age depict winged figures standing over the slain, runic inscriptions speak of blood and honor intertwined, and medieval chroniclers, Saxo Grammaticus, Snorri Sturluson, recorded the ritual with unsettling detail. Even if the Blood Eagle was rare, its idea was real. It lived in the Viking imagination, as a reminder that there were punishments beyond comprehension. In Norse belief, death was not the end. The manner of one's death determined one's fate in the afterlife. To die screaming, begging, or broken was to die in disgrace. But to endure agony in silence, to meet death as a warrior, unflinching, that was transcendence. Those subjected to the Blood Eagle had one final chance to redeem their souls through endurance. If they could suffer without crying out, it was said they would be welcomed into Valhalla as martyrs of truth. But if they screamed, they would fall into hell, the cold, joyless realm of the dishonored dead. The ceremony often took place at dawn, when the rising sun painted the sky the color of blood. The crowd would gather, silent and reverent. Every sound, the slicing of flesh, the crunch of bone, carried across the air like music to the gods. The executioners worked not in cruelty but in devotion. Each motion, each cut, was symbolic, mirroring the myth of Odin himself, who hung from Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear to gain wisdom. In the Viking mind, suffering revealed truth. The blood eagle was the human reflection of that divine torment. Those who witnessed it spoke of a strange beauty, horror woven with holiness. The condemned's blood was believed to purify the land, to cleanse the shame of betrayal. Women and children were sometimes made to watch, not as spectators, but as participants in remembrance. It was said that seeing such pain would keep the young from dishonor. In a society built on loyalty and faith in the gods, fear was not the enemy, it was the teacher. But beneath the myth and ritual lay a chilling psychological purpose. The blood eagle was terror made visible, a message carved into the body of one to control the minds of many. It reminded every Viking that honor was not just virtue, it was survival. To betray one's oath was not merely to risk death, but to risk the destruction of one's soul. The memory of the blood eagle hung over every hall, every oath, every whispered plot. It was the invisible shadow that kept loyalty intact. Imagine standing among the crowd, watching the ritual unfold. You smell the iron of blood in the cold air. You see the ribs glistening in torchlight, curved like pale wings. The condemned man, eyes wide with pain, forces silence, his lips trembling but never crying out. The people watch, not with hatred, but with reverence. They believe he is becoming something more than human, a vessel through which justice speaks. When it is done, the body is left hanging, its hollow chest open to the sky, as ravens descend from above, Odin's own messengers, to claim the offering. The sagas say that after the ritual, the executioners would wash their blades in a stream and chant prayers to the All-Father. The land was now pure again. The gods were satisfied. The people would feast, drink, and tell stories, not of cruelty, but of balance restored. They would speak the name of the condemned not with hatred, but as a warning, a ghost of consequence haunting every promise. The blood eagle endures today not because of its gore, but because of its meaning. It represents the terrifying clarity of a world where faith and violence were one, where the line between religion and brutality no longer existed. To the Vikings, the breaking of a body was sacred. It mirrored the breaking of the soul necessary for redemption. In the blood eagle, we glimpse not just their cruelty, but their theology, a grim philosophy that believed suffering was the only path to truth. In the end, whether the blood eagle was myth or memory, it doesn't matter. Its existence in the human imagination reveals something eternal, that across time, power seeks to prove itself not through killing, but through breaking. The Vikings understood this instinct intimately. Through the blood eagle, they perfected the art of punishment not as death, but as transformation, the moment when pain becomes divine and mercy ceases to exist. There are fates worse than death, and in the Viking world, one of them was to be declared an outlaw. It was a punishment that stripped away everything that made a person human: name, kinship, home, and honor. To be outlawed was to become invisible, untouchable, and damned. No blade struck you down. No rope ended your life. Instead, society itself withdrew from you, like the gods turning their faces away. You were left alive, but in the eyes of your people, you were already dead. When a Viking was found guilty of crimes too severe for ordinary justice, oath-breaking, murder, blasphemy, or cowardice, the thing would convene, and the chieftain or law-speaker would pronounce the ancient words, "He is no longer among us." From that moment, the condemned was Ningur, a word that meant more than criminal. It meant unman, abomination, creature without soul. All rights vanished instantly. Anyone could kill him without consequence, and anyone who helped him shared his curse. This punishment, known as outlawry, existed in two forms. The first was temporary, a lesser exile lasting 3 years, during which the guilty could wander far and return only after paying restitution or proving worthiness. The second, called full outlawry, was eternal. It erased a man from memory. His property was seized, his wife could remarry, and his children were shunned. He became a ghost while still breathing. Imagine it, the silence after the verdict, the crowd stepping back as if the man before them carried a plague. His family looks away, not daring to meet his eyes. His name is carved from the stones that mark his clan. He walks away into the cold wilderness with nothing but a knife and a curse, the sound of his own footsteps echoing against a world that has forgotten him. For the Vikings, this was not mercy. This was annihilation through isolation. In a culture built on kinship, being cut off from one's tribe was spiritual death. Every man's worth was defined by his family, his ancestors, his allegiance to his lord and gods. To be cast out meant to lose not only protection but identity. An outlaw could not enter a home, drink from a shared cup, or sit by the hearth. Even a glance in his direction could invite suspicion. He became Ninger, a warning to others. Children were told tales of these exiles, men who lived like wolves, haunting the edges of villages, half-starved and muttering prayers to gods who no longer listened. But outlawry was more than punishment. It was a psychological crucifixion. In the Viking worldview, where honor was everything, being declared unworthy of community meant your spirit was broken beyond repair. Death was noble if it came with purpose. Exile was meaningless suffering. It denied a man even the redemption of a warrior's death. To live as an outlaw was to drift between worlds, neither living nor dead, neither man nor beast. The Vikings feared this state more than execution. It was the ultimate unraveling of one's being. Some outlaws sought redemption through madness. They wandered the forests, painting runes on trees, offering animal sacrifices, or carving their names into stone in desperate hope that the gods might still see them. Others embraced their damnation. These men became predators, raiders, killers, bandits who attacked the very people who had banished them. To the Vikings, such figures were monsters in human form, living proof that dishonor could corrupt the soul entirely. Yet, even as they were despised, they were also feared, and in that fear lay a twisted form of respect. The sagas tell stories of outlaws like Grettir the Strong, men cursed by fate, wandering across frozen lands in search of meaning. These tales blurred the line between man and myth, depicting outlaws as both tragic and terrifying. Grettir, for instance, fought trolls and ghosts, as if battling the darkness within himself. His story revealed a profound truth about Viking punishment. The physical exile mirrored an inner one. The outlaw's greatest enemy was not hunger or cold, but the crushing weight of solitude, the slow realization that he no longer existed in the eyes of anyone who mattered. Outlawry also carried ritual humiliation. Before banishment, the condemned might be branded, mutilated, or symbolically unmade. His weapons were broken before him, his beard or hair, symbols of masculinity and honor, might be cut off in front of witnesses. Sometimes an stang, a pole with a carved horse head, was raised against him, a curse declaring that the land itself rejected his presence. Birds were said to avoid the soil near such poles, as if nature itself obeyed the decree of the gods. What makes this punishment even more chilling is its silence. There was no blood, no spectacle, no release. The outlaw's suffering unfolded in emptiness. In the long, cold nights where no fire was shared, no name was spoken. He lived hunted by men and haunted by shame. Every whisper of the wind was a reminder that he had been erased. To die under the axe was at least a death among men. To die as an outlaw was to vanish into oblivion. Psychologically, the Vikings understood the horror of loneliness. They knew that stripping someone of connection was more destructive than any blade. In this, they revealed a brutal wisdom, that the human spirit cannot survive without belonging. By casting a man out, they did not merely punish his body, they dismantled the architecture of his identity. The outlaw's body might survive, scavenging fish, sleeping beneath trees, but his spirit disintegrated. Over time, he began to speak less, trust less, believe less. Some took to talking to the wind or to the gods, not knowing if anyone heard. When death finally came, whether by cold, hunger, or the sword of a bounty hunter, it was a relief. The earth accepted what the people had rejected. For the Vikings, this form of punishment served a vital purpose. It reminded everyone that belonging was sacred. It bound communities through fear of isolation, fear of being forgotten. To live honorably was to remain within the circle of trust. To betray it was to vanish beyond its edges, where wolves and spirits ruled. The boundaries of Viking society were therefore not drawn by geography, but by the fragile, invisible line between inclusion and exile. The outlaw, in the end, became a reflection of society's deepest dread, the possibility that one could lose everything, not through death, but through rejection. His existence was a living reminder that identity was a gift granted by others, and that once taken, it could never be reclaimed. And so, when the Vikings exiled a man, they were not merely casting him out. They were enacting a ritual of spiritual destruction, erasing him from the memory of gods and men alike. In that, they achieved the cruelest punishment of all, to make a person live long enough to witness the death of his own soul. The Norse world was one of paradoxes, where women could rule households, own land, and even fight in battle, yet still suffer punishments so cruel and humiliating they erased their humanity. Beneath the songs of shield maidens and goddesses lay another truth, that the Viking Age was governed by fear, shame, and the relentless demand for obedience. For women, punishment was not simply physical, it was symbolic. It struck at the core of identity, sexuality, purity, and power. And in a society obsessed with honor, a woman's punishment often carried the burden of her entire family's disgrace. Viking society was not entirely patriarchal in the way later Christian Europe became, but its structure was unyielding. Women were respected, but within defined boundaries. They could manage farms, inherit property, and demand divorce under specific conditions. Yet these freedoms existed only as long as they upheld their role within the sacred order. When a woman stepped beyond that, when she betrayed her husband, practiced forbidden magic, or challenged the hierarchy, her punishment was designed to remind every other woman what happened when order was defied. Infidelity was among the most severe transgressions. For men, sleeping outside marriage was a boast, but for women, it was an act of treason. Adultery shattered the fragile notion of lineage, the sacred bloodlines that connected clans to their gods. Punishments varied depending on the status of the woman and the rage of the man she betrayed. Some were publicly humiliated, stripped naked, beaten with birch rods, or forced to walk through the village while people spat and jeered. Others were drowned, their bodies tied with stones, or burned alive in ritual pyres meant to cleanse their impurity. The pain was one thing, but the shame was eternal. In Viking culture, humiliation was a death that lingered long after the body was gone. The sagas speak of women accused of witchcraft, the Psychona, feared and desired in equal measure. These women practiced seer, a form of Norse magic that could alter fate, summon visions, or manipulate minds. Odin himself was said to have learned seer from a goddess, yet when mortal women wielded it, society turned against them. The practice was considered effeminate, corrupting, dangerous, an affront to masculine strength. Those accused of seer were tortured into confession. Some were burned, others stoned or buried alive, their mouths filled with ash to silence their spells forever. To the Vikings, magic in the hands of a woman was the ultimate rebellion, control over destiny itself. Public shaming often carried a ritualistic element. A woman accused of defiance, whether sexual, magical, or social, was subjected to symbolic purification. Her hair, the mark of her femininity, would be cut or torn out. Sometimes her clothing was slashed or removed, not simply for humiliation, but as an act of stripping away sin. In the North, where the human body was rarely seen unclothed, exposure itself was punishment, a way to turn her flesh into a warning. In these acts, the community reaffirmed its moral hierarchy, men as enforcers of divine order, women as bearers of its potential corruption. Yet within this darkness lies a deeper contradiction. The same society that punished women so severely also worshipped female deities who embodied chaos, power, and sexuality. Freya, goddess of love and war, rode into battle with a necklace of gold and commanded half of all slain warriors in her realm. Skadi, a giantess, ruled the mountains with her bow and vengeance. Even Hel, the goddess of death, was revered and feared. The Vikings feared mortal women who mirrored these divine figures, those who carried strength, passion, or cunning, because they reflected the gods too closely. Punishing them became a way to control the sacred power of femininity itself. In Viking law, women could also become victims of the thing's political theater. When clans feuded, daughters and wives were often used as instruments of peace or revenge. A woman might be forced into marriage with an enemy's son or executed to avenge her husband's blood. These punishments had nothing to do with her actions. They were messages between men, carved upon the bodies of women. The spectacle of such suffering maintained the illusion of divine justice, a cruel symmetry where pain equaled order. One of the most harrowing punishments was the Bride of Fire ritual. When a widow was accused of treachery, poisoning, adultery, or even suspected witchcraft, she could be bound to her husband's funeral pyre. The belief was that the flames would reunite their souls in death and purge her of sin. Whether myth or memory, these stories reveal how easily faith became cruelty and how women's bodies were turned into vessels for collective fear. There were also punishments of silence. Some women were simply erased, cast out, sold into slavery, or abandoned in remote settlements where they withered from cold and solitude. Viking society understood that exile could destroy the spirit as effectively as the axe. A woman without kinship was not only vulnerable, she was invisible. Her absence became a kind of ghost story told to others. Do not follow her path. But even in suffering, some women defied the system that sought to break them. The sagas are filled with figures like Gurn Osvar's daughter and Brynhildr, who faced punishment without surrendering their pride. They endured humiliation but maintained silence, turning pain into power. In these rare stories, punishment fails to destroy. Instead, it immortalizes. The punished woman becomes myth, her defiance echoing through time as both warning and inspiration. Psychologically, Viking punishments for women reveal an obsession with control, not of the body alone, but of identity. A woman's worth depended on her ability to embody ideals of loyalty, chastity, and obedience. Punishment existed to enforce those ideals and to remind society of the consequences when they were broken. Every act of cruelty had an audience, every scar had meaning. In a world where reputation was eternal, punishment became a weapon not against sin, but against individuality. And yet, the same punishments that were meant to erase women's power inadvertently preserved it. Each saga of betrayal, each legend of the witch burned or the widow buried alive, became part of the Norse imagination, proof that women were too powerful to be forgotten. Their pain became myth, their defiance became legacy. In the flickering torchlight of Viking justice, women stood at the center of a paradox, worshipped as goddesses, feared as witches, punished as sinners. Their suffering was not accidental, it was designed. Each act of pain reaffirmed the fragile order between the divine and the mortal, the masculine and the feminine, the sacred and the forbidden. And as the flames died down, the scent of burnt hair and pine filled the air. The crowd would turn away, murmuring prayers to the gods who demanded such balance. But in the smoke rising toward the northern sky, there lingered something the Vikings could never destroy, the spirit of the women they tried to silence, whispering through the centuries that even in death, they could not be owned. The North was a land forged by extremes, where fire met ice, and life existed only through endurance. The Vikings did not separate themselves from their landscape, they were born of it. The freezing winds, the roaring volcanoes, the long winters without sun, all of it became part of their mythology, their psychology, their concept of justice. To survive in such a world meant learning to respect pain. And in time, pain itself became sacred. Their punishments, drawn from the raw elements of nature, were not merely acts of cruelty but reflections of the world that created them. Fire purified, ice preserved. Between the two, the human soul was tested. The Vikings lived in constant awareness of their environment's hostility. Storms could destroy ships in seconds. Frost could kill a man in his sleep. They learned early that nature did not forgive weakness, it demanded sacrifice. And so, their punishments mirrored this divine indifference. When the law called for retribution, it did not rely only on weapons but on the elements themselves. Fire, water, ice, and earth became tools of justice, extensions of the god's will. One of the oldest forms of ordeal was vatnspraf, the water test. The accused, often charged with theft, witchcraft, or oath-breaking, would be bound and thrown into icy water. The logic was paradoxical. If they sank, they were innocent, for the water, pure and sacred, accepted them. If they floated, they were guilty, rejected by the element that represented truth. Many drowned, proving their innocence, their bodies frozen and still beneath the black surface. To the Vikings, this was not tragedy, it was purification. The gods, they believed, demanded a price for truth, and that price was life itself. In the harshest winters, punishment could be an offering to the cold. Exile meant death by frost. Sometimes, condemned individuals were tied to stakes on frozen lakes or left naked in the snow, their bodies becoming sculptures of ice. It was said that when their final breaths turned to mist, their souls rose to the gods. To freeze to death was not always seen as disgrace, it was a confrontation with the divine, a test of endurance against the most merciless of gods, nature itself. But to beg for warmth, to scream or curse the cold, was seen as weakness, proof that one's spirit had already broken before the body did. Fire, on the other hand, represented both destruction and rebirth. To the Vikings, it was not simply a weapon but a purifier, a living embodiment of the divine. Execution by fire was reserved for crimes that tainted the soul, witchcraft, betrayal, blasphemy. The condemned would be bound to a wooden frame, surrounded by kindlings soaked in oil or animal fat. The fire was not always meant to consume quickly, it was fed slowly, deliberately. The crowd watched in silence, believing the flames would burn away corruption, carrying the soul upward in smoke to face judgment. Yet fire was also used in less final forms of punishment. Branding was a mark of eternal shame, a physical scar that made guilt visible to all. The iron, heated until it glowed white, was pressed against the flesh as witnesses chanted the names of the gods. The smell of burning skin mingled with smoke, and the sound of sizzling became part of the ritual. Those branded were forever altered, not just in body but in status. No man could hide his sin once the gods had left their mark upon him. There were also punishments that used the duality of fire and ice, extremes designed to test both body and spirit. Some accounts tell of offenders forced to stand barefoot on frozen ground while hot coals were placed in their hands. If they could endure the pain without dropping the fire, their innocence was proven. If they faltered, their screams declared their guilt. The trial by elements was not just a test of the flesh but of faith. The Vikings believed the gods would grant endurance to the righteous, and abandon the wicked to their own weakness. The psychology behind these punishments was profound. The Vikings saw themselves as extensions of the natural world. To suffer at the hands of fire or ice was to communicate directly with the gods who ruled those forces. Pain was dialogue, endurance was prayer. The condemned was not only judged by society but by creation itself. And in that sense, punishment became a kind of spiritual purification, a merging of human agony and divine truth. This belief was rooted deeply in Norse cosmology. The world, they said, began in the void between fire and ice, Muspelheim and Niflheim. From their clash came life itself. Every flame, every snowstorm, every punishment reenacted that cosmic origin, the eternal struggle between creation and destruction. When a man was burned, he became a mirror of the first fire. When he froze, he joined the stillness of the ice that formed the world's foundation. To the Viking mind, these were not contradictions. They were sacred reflections of divine order. Even death by drowning, one of the most common punishments for women accused of adultery or witchcraft, carried this elemental symbolism. The sea, vast and merciless, was a gateway between worlds. To drown was to be taken by Ran, the sea goddess, who gathered the dead into her net. The waves were both executioner and escort, cruel yet necessary. The Vikings both feared and revered this fate, knowing that water did not just destroy life, it also returned it to the cycle. There were also rituals involving the earth itself. Burial alive was rare but reserved for acts considered beyond redemption, such as betraying one's kin. The condemned would be placed in a shallow grave, bound, and covered with soil while the crowd recited prayers to ensure the spirit could not return. The weight of the earth was both punishment and sealing, a way to trap the corruption beneath the world it had defiled. The sound of the last handful of soil was said to echo like thunder, the voice of the gods closing the case forever. Each element, fire, ice, water, and earth, served as judge, jury, and executioner. Together, they formed the spiritual backbone of Viking justice. Their punishments were not arbitrary but cosmic, reflections of a universe where suffering was the only true measure of worth. To endure pain was to honor the gods. To resist it was to defy them. And yet, beneath this logic was something darker, an understanding of the human mind. The Vikings knew that pain alone could control, but suffering with meaning could transform. By linking punishment to divine order, they ensured that every act of cruelty became justified, even sanctified. The people watching the condemned burn or freeze were not witnessing horror, they were witnessing order restored. As night fell over the north, the flames of punishment flickered against the snow, the orange glow reflected in the eyes of those who watched. The condemned were gone, but their screams lingered, carried by the wind across frozen fjords. In that terrible beauty, the Vikings found a kind of peace. For to them, pain was not chaos. It was truth, shaped by fire and ice, written into the bones of their world. And through that truth, they believed, the human spirit could finally be broken and reborn. The gods of the Vikings were not distant or merciful beings. They bled, they suffered, they died, and in doing so, they shaped the Viking understanding of life, pain, and punishment. To the Norse mind, the divine was not perfect but wounded, not serene but tormented. Their gods mirrored humanity, with all its flaws and fury, only elevated to cosmic scale. Odin's self-mutilation, Tyr's sacrifice, Loki's torment. These were not mere myths but blueprints for endurance. The Vikings believed that to suffer was to draw closer to their gods, to feel the same agony that sustained creation itself. At the heart of this belief stood Odin, the All-Father, the seeker of knowledge, the god who gave everything to understand everything. His wisdom was born of pain. He plucked out one of his own eyes and cast it into Mimir's well to gain vision beyond sight. Later, he hung himself from Yggdrasil, the world tree, pierced by his own spear, for 9 days and 9 nights without food or water. He died and was reborn, not by the mercy of the gods, but by the power of his own suffering. To the Vikings, Odin's torment was sacred proof that knowledge demanded sacrifice. Pain was not a curse, it was the price of enlightenment. Every act of punishment in the Viking world carried echoes of this divine example. When a man was tortured or executed, he was not merely being punished, he was reenacting Odin's ordeal. His suffering was an offering, his endurance a reflection of divine will. This belief gave Viking cruelty its terrible beauty. Pain became holy. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about transformation. Tyr, the god of law and war, embodied another kind of sacrifice, the loss of honor for the sake of order. When the monstrous wolf Fenrir grew too powerful, the gods decided he must be bound. But Fenrir demanded that one of them place a hand in his jaws as a sign of trust. Only Tyr was brave enough. When the binding spell took hold, the wolf bit down, severing Tyr's hand. His wound became the eternal symbol of justice, that true order always requires blood. The Vikings invoked Tyr's name when carrying out executions, believing that their punishments echoed his divine loss. And then there was Loki, the trickster, the deceiver, the one who dared to defy divine order. When his treachery brought death to Baldur, the beloved son of Odin, Loki was hunted, captured, and bound in a cave. There, the gods placed a serpent above him, dripping venom onto his face. His wife, Sigyn, stayed beside him, catching the poison in a bowl. But whenever she turned away to empty it, a drop would fall, burning his skin, making him convulse in agony. His screams were said to cause earthquakes. Loki's punishment was eternal, a divine reminder that deceit, even among gods, carried endless consequence. Through these myths, the Vikings learned that the gods themselves endured pain as part of cosmic balance. Suffering was not punishment alone. It was participation in the grand narrative of existence. When humans suffered, they weren't alone, they were imitating divinity. Every lash, every cut, every drop of blood spilled in punishment connected them to the gods who ruled through torment. This made pain not only tolerable but purposeful. This theology of agony extended even into the afterlife. Valhalla, the warrior's paradise, was not a realm of peace, but of endless battle. Each day, the chosen dead fought and killed one another. Each night, they were resurrected to feast together before fighting again. Their eternity was not rest but repetition, the cycle of struggle and renewal. To die in pain was not tragic, it was preparation for eternal combat beside the gods. Even in their paradise, the Vikings could not imagine joy without suffering. This is what made their punishments so psychologically powerful. They were not designed to destroy faith, but to reinforce it. To watch someone endure pain without breaking was to see the gods reflected in mortal flesh. The condemned who faced death with silence was almost sanctified, his suffering proof of divine strength within. The coward who screamed or begged, by contrast, proved his separation from the sacred. In this way, punishment became a test of one's relationship with the gods. To endure pain was to belong, to reject it was to fall from grace. The rituals of punishment often included invocations to Odin or Tyr. The executioner might whisper prayers before striking, calling upon the All-Father to accept the sacrifice. In some regions, victims' blood was sprinkled on stones or weapons, a sacred act known as blot, offering life back to the gods who granted it. The boundary between execution and worship blurred completely. Pain was the altar. The body was the temple. In this spiritual logic, even cruelty had order. The Vikings didn't see themselves as torturers but as participants in divine law. Their gods demanded pain because they themselves endured it. The act of punishment was both reenactment and offering, the eternal echo of divine suffering playing out in mortal form. But this divine mirroring came with a psychological cost. When a culture sanctifies pain, empathy becomes weakness. Pity is blasphemy. A man watching his enemy's execution might feel the stirrings of compassion, but he would silence them, believing that mercy insulted the gods who had suffered more. This suppression of empathy created a society where cruelty felt like righteousness, and where violence was not only permitted but revered. Even the sagas, the poetic histories of the Vikings, treat suffering with reverence. Heroes endure torture, betrayal, and mutilation, yet the focus is never on their pain, but on their silence. Stoicism was the highest virtue, because it reflected divine fortitude. The man who met agony with calm defiance was closest to the gods. He was, in their eyes, already ascending. Over time, these beliefs transformed punishment into a form of sacred storytelling. Each execution became a myth reenacted, each cry of pain a verse in the song of the gods. The Norse understood that life was temporary, but legacy eternal. A man's endurance in suffering could outlive his flesh, retold in sagas, remembered in carvings, immortalized in legend. Thus, pain became the bridge between mortality and eternity. In this way, the Vikings built a theology not of comfort, but of confrontation, one where divinity was found in the willingness to suffer. Their gods were not distant arbiters of mercy, but comrades in torment. They ruled through pain, and their worshippers followed willingly, seeking in agony the meaning of life itself. As the sagas say, Odin's wisdom came from wounds, Tyr's justice from loss, Loki's fate from betrayal. The gods did not promise peace, they promised endurance. And in their image, the Vikings built a world where every punishment, every scar, every scream, was a reflection of divine truth. When the flames rose, when the axe fell, when the ice claimed its victims, they believed the gods were watching, not in cruelty, but in communion. To suffer was to speak their language. To die in pain was to enter their realm. The gods of the Vikings did not teach love or forgiveness. They taught only one lesson: that greatness is carved through agony and divinity is reached through pain. Mercy is a luxury of peace, and in the Viking world, peace was a stranger. Their civilization rose in a landscape that demanded cruelty to survive. But over time, cruelty itself evolved, no longer a necessity of nature, but a moral ideal. To the Vikings, mercy was weakness, softness that invited decay. True honor, they believed, was born from endurance and violence. It was not enough to punish an enemy, he had to be broken. The Vikings did not merely kill their foes, they dismantled them, body and soul, until no trace of pride or rebellion remained. It was in this brutal logic that the death of mercy was born. In the sagas and oral traditions, punishment was not viewed as vengeance, but purification. The guilty man, the coward, the betrayer, each one was a wound in the moral flesh of the community. And wounds had to be cleansed, no matter how much blood it took. The Vikings had no word that perfectly translated to forgiveness. Their world had no need for it. A man either balanced his wrongs with sacrifice or he did not. There was no middle ground. If he could not pay his war guild, his life became the currency. Cruelty in the Viking world carried structure, purpose, and ritual. It was rarely random. The axe that severed, the fire that burned, the ice that consumed, each was an instrument of balance. Yet beneath this logic lurked something darker, the thrill of power. The same people who claimed to serve the gods' justice often found pleasure in the spectacle of punishment. Crowds gathered not only to witness moral order restored, but to feel the rush of dominance, the satisfaction of knowing that someone else's suffering preserved their safety. The execution grounds were not places of chaos but of ceremony. Wooden posts carved with runes stood like totems, watching as each act of punishment unfolded beneath their gaze. Every stroke of the blade was deliberate, almost reverent. Before the killing blow, the condemned might be asked to speak, to confess, to praise the gods, or to curse his fate. His final words would echo across the crowd like a moral sermon. Whether he met death with silence or screams determined how he would be remembered. The crowd did not look away, they studied his face. His suffering was their mirror, a reminder of what it meant to remain within the sacred boundaries of strength and loyalty. This normalization of cruelty shaped Viking psychology. Compassion was a crack in the armor, a dangerous emotion that could lead to weakness. Parents taught their children that pain was instruction, that endurance was divine. Even love was tied to violence. A father who did not strike his son in discipline was seen as failing his duty. The Vikings believed that life itself was a battlefield of tests, and pain was the measure of character. Mercy in this world was a betrayal of the cosmic order. In many sagas, the heroes are not defined by how they lived, but how they suffered. Take the tale of Ragnar Lodbrok, captured by the Northumbrian king, thrown into a pit of serpents, and yet laughing as he died. His defiance became legend, not because of victory, but because of how he faced defeat. The sagas never glorify the soft-hearted, they immortalize those who embraced torment as destiny. Ragnar's laughter in agony was the Viking ideal distilled, a soul that refuses mercy because mercy diminishes honor. Even among the gods, compassion was dangerous. Odin's pursuit of knowledge demanded sacrifice, not kindness. Tyr lost his hand for justice, not love. Thor's thunder was vengeance, not protection. The divine reflected the mortal, powerful, proud, and pitiless. And so, the people followed their god's example, convinced that the world's balance depended on cruelty. This mindset explains why the Vikings could execute with calm precision, why they could look into the eyes of a condemned man and see not tragedy, but necessity. Their punishments were performances of divine will. A man who begged for mercy was not pitied, he was despised. His fear was proof of corruption, of weakness unworthy of the afterlife. The condemned who accepted death in silence, by contrast, was honored. His suffering cleansed him. In their eyes, mercy did not save the soul, suffering did. Yet, within this grim justice, there was an unsettling duality. The Vikings admired courage and loyalty even in their enemies. There are tales of captives treated with respect if they died bravely, of women who were spared humiliation for meeting death without fear. Cruelty and honor existed side by side, inseparable. The same man who tortured a slave without remorse might share his last drink with a condemned warrior who refused to scream. The difference was not morality, it was strength. The Viking concept of honor was absolute. It existed beyond emotion, beyond morality. Mercy disrupted that purity because it introduced uncertainty, a pause between judgment and punishment. And uncertainty was the enemy of order. To maintain their spiritual symmetry, the Vikings had to believe in inevitability. Every crime had its consequence, every act its echo. To forgive was to deny the gods their due. To spare was to challenge the universe's balance. Thus, cruelty became virtue, and mercy, sin. In this belief, cruelty was elevated to art. The execution ground became a stage where humanity performed its own annihilation. Pain was the language of the divine, spoken fluently by those who understood its meaning. The slow death, the ritual humiliation, the deliberate display of endurance, all of it formed a theology of agony. The condemned man's body became scripture, his suffering, the sermon. What makes this terrifying is not the violence itself, but the conviction behind it. The Vikings were not sadists in the modern sense. They did not inflict pain for chaos or pleasure alone, they did it with faith. They truly believed that cruelty maintained the order of the world, that without it, everything, justice, loyalty, courage, would collapse into darkness. And perhaps this is why their punishments still haunt us today. Because beneath their savagery lies a question we still struggle with. Do we punish to seek justice, or to affirm power? The death of mercy in Viking culture marked the birth of something enduring, the idea that pain could justify itself. Every age since has echoed it in its own way, in wars fought for honor, in prisons that claim to correct, in the silent satisfaction of seeing others suffer for our sense of order. The Vikings only made visible what humanity still hides, the strange pleasure of cruelty disguised as righteousness. As the fires burned low on the execution fields, the wind carried the scent of ash and salt from the sea. The crowd dispersed, their voices quiet, their hearts steady. Another balance restored. Another life consumed in the name of justice. In the distance, the ravens circled, Odin's watchful eyes, gathering the souls of the condemned. The north was silent again. But beneath that silence, beneath the snow and stone, the echo of cruelty endured, ancient, sacred, and unrepentant. The Vikings did not need mercy, because to them, pain was truth. And in that truth, they found divinity. They believed that only through cruelty could the soul be stripped bare and shown to the gods. To suffer was to be seen. To die without mercy was to be remembered forever. The snow has stopped falling. The fires have gone out, leaving only smoke curling against the frozen sky. Centuries have passed since the Viking punishments ended, yet their echo still drifts across time. They believed pain revealed truth, that through suffering, the spirit was purified and judged by the gods. Mercy, to them, was weakness, cruelty was order. But as we look back, their world reflects our own. We no longer carve justice into flesh, yet we still glorify endurance, still seek redemption through pain. The Vikings turned cruelty into faith, but in doing so, they showed us a mirror, one that forces us to ask if humanity ever truly outgrows its hunger for power through suffering. In the end, their punishments failed to destroy what they feared most, the resilience of the human spirit. The body breaks. The soul endures. And across the cold silence of history, the echo of their world whispers one final truth, that pain, once sanctified, never disappears. It simply changes its face.